Thank you, Margarita. Thank you very much for inviting me to this workshop. So I would like to say first that compared to what we have seen before, this is much more preliminary. So we're very happy to have some comments. Or at the same time, I think it's very related to some of what we've seen, especially Matt's talk, because we are going to focus on like how a specific institution, schools, can shape friendship networks. And I think this echoes very much what you've underlined in your talk. So I'm really looking forward for some feedback. We're going to talk about social diversities in schools. We have a very diverse team of a group of authors. So it's a joint work with Ghazala, who's in this room, Yann, I think who's watching online, Bramoulet from AMSE, Aristide Oundetungor, who's also in the room, yes, Élise Wildry from Dauphine, and Youssef Swidi from Institut des Politiques Publiques. So I guess I don't have to motivate so much the first bullet point that schools play a critical role in shaping society. Of course, we think of schools as where people and students acquire intellectual skills, but not only social emotional skills. But that's not all. Of course, a lot of your social interactions, the friends you're going to make through school. And of course, if we have on the one hand schools for rich kids, schools for poor kids, we might be concerned that excessive social segregation may lead to perpetuate inequalities, prejudice. It may affect social emotional skills, may affect social aspirations, and ultimately social mobility. So, and beyond that, we're all painfully aware that these kind of segregations in schools, they may also lead to social fragmentation, anti-elites, resentment, mistrust. So, in response to this, in some places at least, there have been initiatives to desegregate schools. It's been the case in the past, at least in the US, we say busing policies. And the question then is, how do students actually react when they are placed in more diverse environments, especially in terms of how they form friendships? And that's going to be the focus of this paper. So what we're going to use here is a large-scale desegregation program that was implemented in France starting in 2016, and it concerned 56 public middle schools in France. Specifically, we're going to focus on what we call a high-exposure gap sample. I'll say more about that. Basically, we're going to focus on, among these schools, those that had the highest potential for desegregation. We'll see that not all schools had a high potential for desegregation. We're going to focus on those that where the policy had a larger effect in terms of desegregation, and also not all students in the neighborhoods there were going to be exposed to as much desegregation. So we're going to focus on a subsample, which is still pretty large. We are going to focus on about 2,000 students in 27 treated schools, and we're going to have a control group of about the same size in 31 schools. I'll explain more about the construction of these treatment and control groups. Just to give you an overview of what the program, what were the effects of the program on exposure. We define students' socioeconomic status based on the occupation of the legal guardian. Here, we don't split half-half. We use the official categorization of the Ministry of Education, where we're going to have 37 high, 77% high, and about 2/3 low SES. I'll tell you more what they correspond to. The program effectively increased the exposure of low SES to high SES schoolmates by from a baseline of having 23% high SES kids in their school to went up by 8.3%. So a pretty substantial change. For high SES students, the effect was from a baseline of 42% exposure to low SES in their school, went up by 13%. So this is a substantial change that we're going to exploit to look at, well, how does this going to affect the friendships of these kids? If you think that kids make friends at random, you would find that would be the effect. You would expect that they have so many more friends from the other social group. And, well, that's not what we're going to find. And we're going to try to unpack what's going on in terms of course, the exposure effect, the homophily effect that Matt described. So we have a companion paper where we analyze the effect of this desegregation program on students' outcomes. I'll just mention some of the key results coming from this. The first thing is this desegregation program did not actually lead to a large flight or a significant flight to the private sector. Here we're talking about integrating public schools. So you may think that, as has been shown in other papers, this could lead to a white flight, for example. Well, we don't find this. In our case, the families, especially high SES families, did not go more to the private sector. And when we focus on the outcomes for high SES and low SES students, well, for high SES students, and actually for low, we don't actually find any effects on their academic outcomes. So no adverse effects for the high SES, no gains for the low SES, so not much in terms of reducing education inequalities in academic outcomes. We do find bigger effects on social emotional outcomes of this desegregation program. The biggest effect for the high SES that we find is very significant gains in academic self-esteem, how they perceive their own performance, and we can think there are relative rank effects, big fish in a small pond effects that play a big role. So that's something that stands out for them. For the low SES, we find a wide range of positive effects on their well-being, their social attitudes. For example, we find that they exhibit less social fatalism. They exhibit more norms of cooperation. And so, of course, this may ultimately impact their educational outcomes in the long run, as we know that, the kind of choices you made, for example, in higher education, don't only depend on your academic outcomes, they also depend a lot on these other skills that you learn or that you acquire at school as much as the information you could get. So that's it for this paper. In this presentation, we will focus on the effect of the program on friendship networks. And we use a specific survey that we conducted as part of this research where we asked kids to nominate friends. We asked specifically kids to nominate friends from their classroom. Note something important in France, in middle school, the main, kids are in a classroom and they stay in this classroom throughout the year. This is the main locus of interactions. So it's not like in other countries. I think in the UK there's more mixing across classes. Here you really stick with one class the whole year. A class size here on average is 26 kids. So what do we find when we ask kids about their friends in terms of the effect on the share of low SES friends for the low SES and the opposite for the high SES? Well, we find much smaller effects. So we remember the exposure effect would have been 8 and 13. Here we find much smaller effect of 2.9 for the low SES, saying increase of 2.9 among in terms of the share of high SES among their friends, 4.8 for the high SES. Yeah.
Sorry, I think I'm missing a sense of timing here. You're looking on the same year, right?
So we're looking at kids who enter. I'll say more about the research design, but we're looking at kids who entered grade 6 after the experiment took place, and we follow them for 2 years. So we have a survey wave at the end of grade 6 and a survey wave at the end of grade 8. And we compare the treated and control. So we do find, and these effects are significant, we find an impact on friendships, but much lower than expected, what's going on. So we analyze the formation of friendships using dyadic regressions, where we study homophily. And so note here, homophily, we define it, there's many different definitions, so it's more like a statistical definition would be the tendency to befriend same SES peers above and beyond what would be expected under random pairing. Okay, so it's not homophily in terms of saying, well, low SES kids tend to have more low SES friends than high SES, because that could be a mix of exposure effects and what we call homophily, which is this tendency above and beyond what would come from purely exposure. So we study this homophily as defined here, and also we develop a methodology to account for a specific feature of our survey, but it also is the case in many other surveys, that we didn't ask the kids to nominate all possible friends. We asked, to nominate 5 at max. Maybe we shouldn't ask the question like this, but it's too late. But many actually surveys of friends actually have this feature. AdHealth, I think, has this feature. And we develop a methodology to account for this censoring. Yeah.
Maybe just one question. This homophily could be indeed driven by the children, but also if they are very young by the parents.
Yeah, so the kids are around 11 to 13-year-old.
Yeah, okay.
But, you know, of course,
They are free.
some of this homophily could be driven by, you know, we have information on the primary schools they came from. So some of it could be, you know, friendships you made very early on that could be influenced. I think there's still a lot of renewal of friendships when you enter middle schools. So, and what we're going to measure is what happens when you start mixing. You know, there's this dependency. What happens, you know, to what extent things change when you mix the kids. So just to give you a preview of the main result, in case I don't get to the end, the first thing is, well, friendship networks, they do exhibit substantial SES homophily in the control schools, which would be our baseline here. Actually, we find it more for high SES students that they form relatively more friendships with other high SES students. And note that this baseline homophily already reduces program effectiveness. So already is this homophily, you wouldn't expect the 8 percentage point increase in exposure to produce 8 percentage point increase in friendship share. So baseline homophily is already something that's going to reduce the program. But what we also find is that treatment increases homophily. That is that the propensity to make friends from the same group, so in-group homophily, is exacerbated in the more diverse schools. And that further reduces program effectiveness. And then we can try to get to a decomposition of the treatment effect. And we find that without the behavioral reaction, the increase in friendship diversity would have been 2.5 times higher than what we find. So it substantially mitigates what you can expect from these desegregation programs. Although, of course, at the end, we still find a significant effect on friendships, but much lower than expected. And I'll say more about how we try to unpack a little bit more what's going on here, because there could be a concern that SES for homophily could be capturing something else, like kids from the same primary school. And we'll see that it's actually, even when you control for all these things, it's still really driven by this SES homophily. So I'll be quite brief on the relation to the literature, just to say there's a quite large literature on school desegregation, mostly from the US, focused especially on the policies that were, the affirmative action policies that were implemented, busing especially. There's not so much in this literature on friendship networks. It's more on short-run educational and long-run outcomes. So that's what I would say we would add to this literature. There's a broader literature on social and racial mixing, not specifically focused on schools, but for example, in dorms, a Boisjoli et al. Paper on how the exposure to a black roommate, for example, influence your perceptions towards racial diversity and affirmative action. So these papers, and they focus a lot on the effects of racial and social mixing on prejudice, on stereotypes. They document also behavioral responses to mixing. Here, we focus on this really in the context of schools. And we insist on the importance of these behavioral reactions. There's a very also large literature on homophily networks, to which Max, of course, is one of the major contributors. Matt has presented already his work, and I think this is very closely related to especially Social Capital 2, where you focus on connectedness in schools, and some of the patterns you uncover, they are somewhat consistent with what we find here. Here, what we contribute to is, I think we use this actual policy experiments where some variation could be driven by, say, from one cohort to the next. There could be changes in. Here, it's a policy-driven intervention, which would mimic more what a desegregation program would be, which not only is about marginal changes in the social composition, but also about the kids moving, for example, to another school. And there's a smaller literature, but growing, on the impact of interventions in networks, mostly focused on the papers in the context of microcredit in India, how they affect networks. A paper on Syrian refugees in primary schools in Turkey. So the contexts are quite different from what we study here, and we think we bring a few methodological contributions with respect to this literature. So just to give you an outline of the talk, so I'll give some institutional background about the context, like the French context we're studying. the research design and data, and I'll finish with some results. So some context first. For those of you not familiar with the French educational system, school in France is compulsory from the age 6 to the age 16. Primary school is 5 grades, from grade 1 to grade 5, and that finishes around grade 10. We're focusing on middle school, which in France is called collège. I guess in the US it's junior high school. And that goes from grade 6 to grade 9, 4 grades from age 11 to age 14. Note one thing important, it's a common curriculum. There's not so much, there's no differentiation in junior high school. Differentiation, say, between vocational education and general education starts after that. And also, there's not so much room for differentiation across classrooms. In some schools, you have some specific classes that you can take, but generally speaking, it's really very homogeneous. Another thing to note, teachers in France are centrally allocated to schools through a centralized assignment mechanism, so that also limits some scopes for differentiation along these lines. How are students assigned to public middle schools? So it's really a residence-based assignment, so it depends on your address, and you get assigned to a single public school where you have a guaranteed seat. So it's really school zoning. There's no school choice in middle school. It occurs in high school choice, but there's no school choice here. There is one form of school choice, of course, is private schooling. 21 to 22% of the kids go to private middle schools, but the vast majority would be falling into this system of catchment areas. That means that the kids who are enrolled in a given public school, they tend to come from the neighborhood. You can't really go to a public school very far away from where you live. So the desegregation program we focus on was launched in November 2015, and the Ministry of Education, so then the minister was Najat Vallaud-Belkacem. The goal was to invite local education authorities to propose some actions to reduce social segregation in middle school, segregation being very high in French public schools. As following this process, the ministry identified 22 so-called pilot sites that implemented some actions starting in either 16 or 17. And out of these, I'll tell you more about what these sites did, but out of these 22 sites, we focused on 10 sites that had where there was actually a sufficient potential for change. I'll explain how we measure this potential for change. That is, some of these sites, for example, they would merge 2 schools' catchment area together, but the 2 schools were not so different socially, so there was no real potential for anything to happen. In other places, they actually merged, or they, for example, redesigned the catchment areas of schools where the neighborhoods were very segregated, and that could have an effect. This sample of 10 sites includes 31 middle schools. So each site has 2 to 6 schools, okay? We think of a site as a collection of schools that are impacted by this policy. There's not a single type of action that was taken. There were like 5 different types. So the most classic one would be redrawing catchment areas. So you try to redraw the catchment areas to mix more neighborhoods that are closely located but very socially polarized. Another type of action was opening or closing very segregated schools. That was the case in Toulouse, for those of you who've heard about this experiment. Then another option is you have 2 schools with their own catchment areas. You merge the catchment areas, and you have different ways of assigning kids. One classic way, which is implementing school choice with quotas. So you ask parents to rank the schools, and then you implement a centralized assignment mechanism like a deferred acceptance mechanism where you impose quotas based on social occupation of the parents. So that was done in several places. Another example of another way of doing things is so-called alternate assignment. I explained how this works. It's quite unusual, but it proved out to be quite effective at mixing the kids. And the last option was to introduce attractive elective courses in deprived schools to retain high SES parents who otherwise might have gone to to the private sector or move to another neighborhood. Okay, so this would be like music classes, teaching Chinese in the school.
So it's not simply changing the
No.
of the zone. So
No. We shouldn't think as the treatment as only purely a change in composition. There are other things going on. Now, we think that in terms of when we think about a desegregation program, it's rare to think about a desegregation program that purely only has an assignment component without other things going on. So indeed, it is contextualized with other changes potentially going on. Now, we did look at, to try to describe the treatment, look at what things change. For example, the exposure of kids to more qualified teachers. That's not really the case. Did it change the average size of your school? Not much. The main thing that changes is really the social composition of the school to which you go. Distance increases a little bit, but not that much. But we cannot exclude that there are other components.
At the level of middle school, I mean, there is never such a sophisticated pupil assignment.
No,
it's always a pure zoning. You live in this area, then you go to this school, full stop.
Exactly. So this was, trying to test different ways in which, you could kind of reduce the problem with catchment areas is you're going to reproduce residential segregation within the schools. So if you start implementing school choice with some device like quotas, you can relax this dependence of social segregation on residential segregation. So, but that was, I would not say the most common approach. The most, this is a map of what some of the sites that were implemented, where some of the desegregation program in Paris. There were 3 catchment, so these are catchment areas with 2 schools, and the color shows the kind of gap. So red was more deprived, blue is more socially advantaged. So here, these 2 schools, the catchment area merged, and an alternate assignment mechanism was implemented to allocate the kid. I'll say more about this. Here is an example where a school choice system was implemented, but the schools, they were not so different to start with, so there was not much potential actually for anything here to happen in terms of exposure. So just to describe one of the ways in which desegregation could occur, that would be the classic catchment area system where, depending on where you live, in catchment area A or catchment area B, you're assigned to a school A or school B. Alternate assignment works in the following way. In year T, all the kids from either catchment areas, they would all start school in one of the 2 schools. So you group the 2 cohorts in a single school. The following year, and they would stay in that school throughout. The following year, all the kids are grouped from the next cohort in the other school. So that's a way, and then, of course, in steady state, you have only 2 grade levels per school that alternate. That's why it's called alternate assignment. It's a way to kind of mix the neighborhoods within the schools, which is, sorry.
But now, practical question, which may apply more to life outside Paris. But it was when you mentioned busing, and I was thinking if you're being bused across Boston in the 1970s or whatever, you're probably going to make friends with people on the bus. And so, I mean, Paris, the distances are quite small, but in more rural areas, I can imagine that I know you have different buses from different parts.
Yeah, so the busing, there's not much busing going on here. There's one exception. There was one school that was closed in Toulouse, and there was busing.
But you do get your school bus.
It was a bus that was specifically for the kids every morning to bring them to the school. You wouldn't take public transport.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you wouldn't meet many people on the bus except the kids going to the same school.
But if you have, like where I know in France, there's the college and there's buses from different areas. There's many buses.
No, it is possible. I don't think in the cases we look at, distances didn't really change so much. So I don't think that the transport issue would be a major driver of what we see. But we should we'll focus on that. Okay, so these are the 10 sites. Sometimes not only one action was taken, but a combination. In the interest of time, I'll go to.
Very quickly, so the redrawing of the map tends to add people who went to the same primary school.
Generally, you reassign a primary school is generally mapped into a middle school, so it would be a given primary school would then be assigned to a different middle school.
Exactly.
So the kids from the same primary school would tend to stay together even in a desegregation program.
Yeah, but so this effect is going to be confounded a bit with what you find. And
Yes.
so why don't you use the 10 sites that you excluded to look at whether I have homophily with this added catchment area?
So we're going to do this. So for now, we focused on this sample, which was for the 10 sites. That the survey was only conducted in these 10 sites. But then we have within these sites, we focus on the kids, half of the kids who had the biggest predicted exposure effect. We could focus on the other half, but we find mostly zero effects on them. Okay, so the design, so we had these, initially the 22 pilot sites, we matched them using a nearest neighbor matching approach with control sites. How did we do this? Well, we basically try to form, so say a site has 3 schools, we try to find a control site by forming all possible combination of 3 schools respecting these constraints. They were in the same education district as the treated site. They were not involved in the desegregation program, in the same type of municipality. The maximum distance between 2 schools did not exceed that in the treated site. And we then minimized a distance criterion, which involved social compositions of the schools and average student performance over pre-treatment years. So we're really trying to find the best possible matches for the sites we have. Of course, then it's a question of whether we achieve a good balance or not. I'll show you some tables on that. And then in terms of focusing on a group of schools and students with a high chance of, where predicted exposure would be the largest, I said many students and many schools in the program had a good level of social mixing, so nothing much could happen. The way to focus on these students and schools with high potential for change is we compute this so-called exposure gap, which is intuitively, it's the gap between your exposure to the other social group under full mixing at the site level minus the predicted exposure absent treatment. How do we predict your treatment, your exposure to, say, high SES, if you're a low SES, absent treatment? We use pre-reform data, and we look at all the kids who came from the same primary school as you. What was their exposure? And we use that to predict what would be your exposure. And we look at, so we can get an individual measure of this exposure, hence the I index, that allows us then to focus on a subpopulation of kids for whom the treatment is expected to produce the biggest shock in terms of exposure to the other social group. So we use this selection procedure, and we get 10 sites, and within each site, we look at the top 50% most so-called high gap low SES and the top 50% high gap high SES, and we look at what happens to them following the experiment. So that's a map of the treated and control sites. So for example, a site in Paris here, this site had 3 schools. The control site would be picked from Paris, another 3 schools. Sometimes we allowed the matching algorithm to take a control school, not necessarily in the same academic region. Sometimes hard to find, for Toulouse, he picked up Bordeaux. Some schools in Bordeaux that were a better match than other cities in Toulouse. We have 2 types of data, admin data and survey data. So the admin data, we have it for all the kids, not only those we surveyed. So we have all the kids with their socioeconomic status, and we assign them to either low or high based on the occupation of the so-called legal guardian. So it's a quite patriarchal definition. It's mostly the father, unless there's no father, and then it's the mother. Low SES, you can think of low SES would be without a college education. High SES with a college education, that would be more or less the mapping. And here are the kind of occupations you would get into the 2 groups. We have about 2/3 low, 1/3 high in the sample. We have information on demographics, of course, gender, age, nationality, but we also have information on the primary school the kids came from. This can be used in the analysis because we think maybe friendship networks are influenced by who are your friends, who were your peers, in which primary school were your peers before. So we can control for that. We complemented this with a survey we conducted for students who entered grade 6 in 2018. And we surveyed them at the end of grade 6 and at the end of grade 8. We asked them to nominate up to 5 friends in the class, the average class size being 26. The response rate was quite high. Within surveyed classes, we have 87% of the students who filled in the questionnaire. So that's about 10,000 surveyed students. Survey response rate is balanced between treated and control, about 87%. So, sorry, not all students were surveyed. That's the response rate among the surveyed. Not all students were surveyed because sometimes, for example, some kids, they split a group and some group had a visit somewhere, or they were not all in the class. They could not all be surveyed. Among the students who were surveyed, we have a censoring issue. 62% nominated exactly 5 friends. So we're going to have to deal with this because the censoring here issue is more stringent than, for example, in health data. Then the high exposure gap is basically the kids, half of the kids that we surveyed, the ones that had the highest predicted treatment effect on exposure. That's about 4,000 kids with roughly equally split between treated and control. And here's some balancing tests. Sorry, I'm going to compare these treatment and control sites along a number of dimensions. The first one, of course, to check is, did anything happen in terms of exposure to the other social group for these kids? Is there a first stage? So this would be a measure we measure the exposure of low SES to high SES at the site level, okay? The site level means all the kids among, these 6 schools or 3 schools that were constituting the site. Nothing's happening here. There's no differential trends. The levels are quite aligned. This means that you might expect a divergence here if the program led to a flight, a lot of people moving out of the neighborhood. Then you would expect the exposure at the site level to be, to change between treated and control. But now, when you look at the school level, what happened for the low SES and for the high was that they were more likely to be exposed to the kids from the other group. So, for example, if you look at the site level exposure, so the typical low SES kid in our sample had 40% high SES in the site, but in the school before only 20%. That jumps to about 40%, slightly lower. So it goes almost to full mixing here following the experiment. So there's a pretty sizable shock on the composition of the kids to which these students are exposed to. So then we conduct a number of balancing tests to look at along fairly large number of covariates. These low and high SES kids in the control and treatment sites to see, do we have a good control group here ex ante? So we look at a number of social characteristics, nationality. So first thing to note, the low SES are indeed much more deprived than the high SES. If you look, for example, at test scores, they're 30 percentile ranks lower. They're more likely to have single-parent household, less likely to be born in France. And so there's a pretty big gap between the high and the low. Now, between the treated and control sites, no significant difference here. So we look at and note that we didn't match on all of this. We just matched on test scores at the end of middle schools and the social characteristics of the school. We didn't match, for example, on these entry tests that all the kids take. We didn't have it then. The test scores that the test that the kids take when they enter middle school. And we think that's a pretty important balance to have, that they really score the same when they enter middle school. We also compare the kids along the characteristics of the primary school they came from. That is, what kind of primary school were there before joining the middle school. Again, it's fairly well balanced. There are a couple of differences, but not more than what nominal rate you would expect. They were from much more deprived schools to start with for the low SES than the high. The schools, for example, 40% of these kids low SES were in so-called priority education schools. It's about 0% for the high SES. So they didn't go to the same kind of primary schools to start with. Okay. Now, let me say a few words about the kind of data we're going to be mostly focusing on. It's friendship networks we're studying. So we're going to focus on pairs. So for every student in the class surveyed, we look at all the possible pairs with all the kids from the same class, and we define this indicator here, Gij, which takes the value 1 if I nominated J as a friend. Okay, so we have in total 100,000 pairs of students that we can use in the analysis. So that's all the classes and all the possible pairs in classes. So the dyadic regression framework we use, we basically code, for example, LL dummy equal 1 if student I is a low SES and student J in the pair is also a low SES. And what we are predicting is the probability to be friends, or well, that a given pair is, that I nominates J as a friend, as a function of the characteristics of the pair. Are they both low, low, high, 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 with the reference category here being I is high and J is low. And then we interact all of these dummies with the treatment group so that we measure how these coefficients on every one of these characteristics changes. So for example, if you look at gamma 0 here, given that the reference group is high-low, it means in the treatment group, the probability for a high to nominate a low as a friend, by how much does it go up? Okay. So we focus on this framework. So then we can use these coefficients to say something about homophily and how it changes when the treatment comes in. So the SES homophily in control schools exists if, for example, this coefficient on LL is higher than LH. Why? Well, it means that your probability, if you're low, your probability to nominate a high is higher than the probability to nominate a low. Okay? So comparing these coefficients allows us to say something about homophily. There's SES homophily if this is true for the low, this is true for the high. In treated schools, we can also use the coefficient. So is there also homophily in treated schools? And what's important for us, does homophily increase in treated school relative to control schools? We can also use these coefficients on the interactions between treatment effects, the treatment dummy, and the types of pairs. So we've tested a number of specification linear model, adding some controls, especially for primary schools. But I'll present the basic one with logit without controls for gender, same primary school. The results are quite similar, but they're more kind of cumbersome to go through. Then with these estimates, we can conduct a decomposition where we can measure how the desegregation program is going to affect a friendship. And we know, we look at the treatment effect on the number of friends, for example, a low SES has in the number of high SES friends a low has. And we can decompose this into two effects, a direct effect, which comes purely from the change in the composition of the class, and an indirect effect, which comes from the change in the social dynamics. So there's the treatment effect can be written like this. So this, for example, would be the average number of links that L students have with H students. So that would be for, how many high SES friends do I have when I'm low? This is how much it changes between treated and control. And we can decompose this into a change in composition keeping homophily fixed and a change in homophily keeping composition fixed, which is very similar to a Blinder-Waxaka decomposition. And how do we get to this intermediary number here? Well, that's the predicted links in the treated schools, but where we set this coefficient on the treatment effect interactions to be 0. So that's basically take the homophily of the kids in the treated schools as if it was the same as in the control group, just change the composition, what happens in terms of number of friends. So that's the basic idea. So maybe in just of time, I won't be very long on how we account for censoring. I'll just say a few words. Remember, 62% of the kids nominate exactly 5 friends. They couldn't nominate more, so we need to account for this. So the way we deal with this is to adopt a 2-stage bias correction approach, where basically in the first stage, so for all the kids who nominate strictly less than 5, this is fine, but for those who nominate exactly 5, we have a problem. So the 2-stage correction approach, the first stage is that we're going to approximate the degree distribution, so for a given student, the number of friends, using a Poisson distribution. And we use some results from this paper by Surfling in 78, that the Poisson distribution is a good approximation when the probabilities of the friendship probabilities would be small, and the number of students, or the size of the group is relatively large. Of course, here we have 26 students, so it's a bit borderline. So we conduct some Monte Carlo simulation to see how that works. It works quite well. And then we estimate this censored version of this Poisson distribution via maximum likelihood to then predict for each kid who exactly nominated 5 friends what is the predicted true degree, which is higher basically because you nominate 5 might have 6, 7, 8, and so we predict this for every kid using this model, and then how we use this information? Well, we basically use this information to reweight the whenever a kid nominated 5 friends, these nominated friends, they get overweighted, okay? Because we know they represent more friends in reality. And so the reweighting is, well, this is kind of intuitive. You nominated 5, but the true number of friends you have is this prediction, the predicted degree. And we underweight the cases where you didn't nominate friends. So because among the ones you didn't nominate, maybe there are friends actually, true friends. So that allows us to.
You nominate 6 friends?
No, you can't nominate it 6.
Oh.
You can only make 5 at max. So the
One,
reweighting,
2, or 3, or you can nominate 1, 2.
you can rate it 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the censoring issue for those who nominated exactly 5, the true number of friends could be 6, 7, 8. So these are the ones.
You know that, so it could also be the case that you nominate 2 because you're lazy and you have more.
Yes, okay. So here we correct for the censoring that is kind of imposed by the design of the survey. Another thing important is we achieve here this method for now assumes random at missing. That is, among the friends, you had 7 friends, you randomly picked up the 5 you put here. This may vary by status, so we plan to incorporate this in the censoring approach.
But beyond censoring, there is also the question that Matt had before, which is whether what matters is the number of things or the share of things of each time. And for that, you have no. Maybe having one link from another CS when you have friends can be more important than when you have.
So we're going to present results where we show effects on numbers and shares. So we have both.
Okay, and the zeros, you don't use them?
Not for now.
Maybe the composition can have an effect of having more friends at all.
So yeah, going strictly above 0, having any friend. Yes, true. As well as we'd like to look more in details like new friends. We don't know who are your past friends, but maybe the kids. If a friend you nominate was in your primary school, there's a presumption that he was a friend before. So maybe that's also the kind of extensive margin dimensions we could explore. For now, it's still preliminary. We're just using the whole thing.
But you don't first ask the question, how many friends do you have?
No, that was one part of the survey. Maybe we didn't, when we designed it, we should have taken more time to talk with people working on networks and to design better the question. That's what we have. We can have regrets or try to use that as it is. But it's true that there's probably better ways of designing questions. Although there are also some issues if you put no limit, to what extent you would, you might also get into problems.
If you had asked first how many friends do you have, they say 2.
Then we'd have the data I had there. Yeah, I agree.
You could use the in degree as well to estimate. So people are receiving nominations as well as giving them. And you
Yes.
can use the receiving nominations to see how well your croissant.
Yes. So we haven't explored too much the reciprocity issue. So here we're using really the directed.
You could use it to estimate.
Yes, you're right. That's an idea we'll follow. Okay, some results. So first thing is there is homophily at baseline in the control when we estimate the dyadic regression model. There's status homophily for the high SES. It's not significant for the low. So here, for example, if we take a high SES student who responded to the survey, and we look at all the low SES kids in the class, well, the probability of forming a link where the H nominates L is 15%. If we look at the probability of nominating a high SES friends, it's 2.5 percentage points higher than that. So there's baseline homophily. Here I'm showing the numbers when we control for censoring or when we don't control. When we control, generally controlling for censoring increases a little bit the estimation of homophily. I'm not quite sure why yet. Doesn't really affect the decomposition though we get in terms of the treatment effect. For the low SES, we don't find much evidence of homophily at baseline. Remember, we're talking about homophily in the same classroom. So here we don't have these issues about tracking, for example, between classrooms that would be we would capture this effect. So it's really the kids in your class. Now, when we move to treated schools, we find that homophily is this time goes up for both groups, and so it's the probability is 7.3 percentage points when we don't control for censoring, higher to denominator high than a low when you're high, and 3.9 percentage points to denominator low than a high when you're yourself low. So this is, we find homophily that goes up, and that's where it's coming from. Basically, this is the dyadic regression. So here we compute marginal effects from this model. Then we can use them to compute these different components, the homophily in control for the high and for the low, homophily in the treated for the high and the low. It goes up, and that's the difference between the two. So, and we get the p-values here showing that homophily does go up.
And there's no treatment effect on the number of friends we report?
That's what comes next. So here, that's just the dyadic model where we predict the probability conditional on, in a given pair. If you think, if you take the model as a structural model it would be like a speed dating thing where you meet everyone and you pick, I'm an H, you're an H, I pick a drawer whether we're going to be friends from this probability. Now, the question, of course, is how this predicts friends is going to depend on the shares of highs and lows on top of that model. So that's exactly what we do next. So we decompose the effects on the number of friends and also the share, to answer your question, the number of friends first into a composition and homophily effect. So that's what we find. So if we start from the baseline, so a typical high in the control group says 3.3 high friends, high SES friends. I think this is accounting for censoring. So that would be already accounting for the fact that it could be more than 5 in total. It does because the sum is higher than 5 here. So 3, and so the net effect, the effect in the end is we find that they have fewer high friends. Okay, I'm a high, have 0.24 less high friends in the treated. But when we decompose this into exposure effect and this homophily effect, well, if they did not, if homophily hadn't gone up, they would have had fewer high SES. Okay. Maybe it's easier to see things if we look at, say, the opposite, like cross-group friendships. So, for example, the high SES, they had in the control group 2.1 friends, low SES. It doesn't go up very much due to the treatment. It would have gone up by 0.5 just due to the exposure effect with no behavioral response, but the behavioral response cancels out a substantial share.
My point is you can add up those two, so they have less friends in total.
Yeah, so
so it seems that there's an intensity effect, possibly.
So the total number of friends here goes up. For the low, it doesn't really change because the low would be the total number of friends is the sum of these two.
Yeah.
For the high, they have less. So they mostly. So basically, they lose high SES, but they don't make up exactly the same number in terms of low. There's no substitution. But that's, I would say, kind of compatible with this homophily difference at baseline. The low, they seem to be substituting a high for a low more than the other way around for the high SES, where they don't substitute. Okay. And when we look at shares rather than numbers, but it's not so clear. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, about the sensory, I was wondering if girls and boys came from different groups. For instance, if there are like no girls from low SES in the class, you might have like boys from the low SES, but the high SES girl will not form friendship with him because he's a boy rather than because he's from the low SES.
That's a very interesting point. This is the kind of thing we're unpacking now. We're looking at by gender what's happening. One thing I can tell you what's coming out of the data is that boys in the treated schools, they become less homophilic by gender than they were in the control schools. So it seems that there's like less the boys thing once there's more mixing socially than there is in the control. For girls, nothing really happens. What is clear is that there's huge gender homophily. This dwarfs all the rest. it dwarfs SES homophily, it also dwarfs primary school homophily. That's one big thing. So we're going to add this back and also try to maybe cross gender and SES because the dynamics could be different. But for now, we really don't distinguish.
Something I should have asked before, are they, I mean, so those new kids, this mixing, is it forced? Or? No, I mean, here they can opt out.
Well,
So can there be some selection?
no, that's something we've investigated, and it's mostly forced because the outside option could be private schooling. It's quite, not that easy to get into private schools there. The share is low. We don't see an effect on this dimension. The other option is Thibaut choice. You move out, to another neighborhood. But we don't see this either. We can actually look at the composition of the social composition of the kids residing in the catchment areas. This didn't change either. So it's mostly a forced mixing. And so we're pretty confident that the populations we're looking at, they're similar in terms of their characteristics. But yeah, maybe, so remember, this is the early years of these experiments. Maybe 10 years down the road, things, can change. So we're looking at 1 to 3 years after. In terms of the shares, well, that's maybe simpler to interpret, although I'm not sure. Maybe this is more relevant for if you think about the social capital. I don't know if we should express it as using numbers or shares. I think numbers maybe make more sense here. But in terms of shares, for the share of low SES students for the high SES, so high SES befriend on average have 39% low SES. It would have gone up by 12%. Using the baseline homophily. It's already lower than the 18% we mentioned earlier. It's 4.8 at the end, and we have a similar kind of reduction due to this endogenous response. So that's the table. I'm not going to go in detail into how we get this, but it's basically we predict the numbers, and using, it's a bit like a Oaxaca decomposition, we get the three components that add up to the overall effect, so composition, homophily. And it doesn't really matter so much to control for the censoring in terms of this decomposition. So you have to look a bit more into it. But what does change is, of course, when you count for the censoring, the numbers go up because we're counting more friends that are not declared. Okay. So yeah, that's fine. In terms of proportions, it's the same. So so in the end, the overall effects remain significant in terms of shares. We do find that the share of the other SUS group among your friends significantly goes up for both groups. So in that sense, the treatment is effective, but much less than what you would have under if homophily had not changed. Yeah, the last thing that we started to do is to add controls for gender and for same primary school. So what could be a concern if you start to interpret what's going on? Maybe SES homophily is actually confounded by same. In fact, it's not about SES, it's that you tend to befriend kids who were from the same primary school. So and since primary schools are segregated, that's what we're capturing. So we have added this information in the dyadic regression and performed the same decomposition. So what we find is there's very large homophily by gender, and it goes down for boys in treated schools. So that's one thing. Maybe I have that. It's a very ugly table, but gender homophily, the change so you see the numbers 0.25, they're really much larger in terms of gender homophily than for other dimensions. But for girls, it's pretty much the same in treated and control. For boys, it goes from 25 to 19. So there is a reduction for boys in terms of this gender homophily. We don't find so much change in the homophily by primary school. And when we control and redo the decomposition, it doesn't really affect the treatment effect decomposition. So we still get that most of this, what we have labeled as a change in social economic status homophily, is not driven by this. All right. So for once I'm on time. So just to recap, we focused on this large desegregation program on friendship networks. We find a big effect on exposure, positive but much lower impact on friendship diversity, although there is still one. This reduction effectiveness comes from two things. The baseline homophily, as I define it, so that is the above and beyond random pairing, to which there is this added reduction in homophily due to treatment itself. And so this underlines the importance of accounting for behavioral reactions, because of course, as a policymaker, if I'm expecting the number of friendships formed by my policy just based on how it's going to affect exposure, I'm going to get it pretty wrong. And so probably we shouldn't think maybe of exposure and homophily as being orthogonal, but actually that homophily depends on exposure itself. That's maybe something to reflect on, and that's where we're at for the moment on this project. Thank you very much.
I mean, I'm a bit surprised that not more families would react negatively against this different position. So, and I mean, the higher income families usually, I mean, if you force them to go to a school where you have
Yeah.
low SES,
But we have.
then they go to, especially in Paris, where you have 40% of all children go to private schools in Paris.
You're right,
Or
but there's something we should think about when you think at the site level thing. Often, if you're going to mix two schools together, say there was one socially advantaged school and one more disadvantaged, the mechanism you're describing applies to the highest CS parents who were sending their kids to the historically socially advantaged schools. But there's also another group of parents, the high SES parents living in the catchment area of the deprived schools. And in Paris, there are many. They didn't put their kids in that school. Now they can come back. And often, these kind of flows, inflows and outflows, they tend to compensate each other. And in net, the total flight is not positive. That's kind of what other research has shown.
Because I was thinking, I mean, maybe it's due to the change in the zoning system. I mean, now you have this assignment mechanism, which is deferred acceptance. I don't know what you're using exactly. I mean, so maybe parents. I mean, there is a nudge. Here, parents feel that they have more choice, and so they would comply.
Yeah, but
Whereas,
you could.
if you were forcing them to go.
No, you observe this also in catchment area redesign, where the area that gets reassigned to the worst, the more deprived school, there's more flight, but the area that was historically assigned to the deprived school goes to the more advantaged school. People come back. So the flows, the flight doesn't go always in one direction. It depends on the difference between the reassignments. And when you think at the site level, the reassignments have to be balanced. So that's one reason why in aggregate you don't necessarily expect a flight. That's my...
So you can also look at the homophily effect by the composition mixture. So there's this finding in the old sociology literature and some of the stuff we saw with Sergio, whereas you get closer and closer to 50-50.
Yes,
mixtures,
exactly.
You get this more homophily. Do you see that effect?
So, in social capital too, remember you also find this kind of bell-shaped curve. So what we actually plan to do is look at the control schools and see if this relationship we uncover from this intervention actually exists in the control. And do we see, because we have about, 30 schools there, to see if this pattern exists there. So we'll see about power, but at least I think we can see as a test also if this quasi-natural variation mimics what we observe in ecological situation or not. So that's one potential route for looking at that.